Well, good morning, First Christian. How's it going today? Good? All right, good. Gets a little bit cloudy. It seems to have maybe made a few of us cautious today. So we'll pray for them and hope that everything's okay with them. But thank you guys for joining us, for braving the elements. Because this is the harsh reality we live in Arizona, that sometimes we have to put up with weather like this. We're going to be in Ephesians chapter 4 today, so if you want to turn there, we'll start there in just a minute. This is the penultimate sermon of our Shape to Serve series, and with this, we're really going to talk about something that's really vital to us in our Christian life today, and that is that serving sets us apart. And what does it mean that serving sets us apart? Well, in the Bible, there's a term called it's just holy. And we use it a lot, but we only use it within certain circles. We only use it within religious circles. And the idea of being holy is strange to us. But it's important to understand that really what holiness is talking about is it's talking about being set apart. And service is a big part of this. And so we want to look at that today. We're going to be in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13. So if you want to go there, then please do so. If not, just follow along with me. I'm going to be reading today out of the NIV. Usually we do ESV, but there's a little bit of change in wording that I found helpful to us in this, so we'll read it a little differently today. And it's important to understand that when we look at this passage in Ephesians verse 4, you're not going to see the word holiness here. And in fact, what you have to understand is that holiness is kind of the background information of what's being talked about here. And we'll get into that here in a second, but there's an overall kind of biblical understanding of the way that reality exists. And this is just a small part of it. So let's go ahead and read in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13. It says, So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers, to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up, until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. So what this passage is teaching us is that there are various offices and various gifts within the church, and that God gave us these things for a specific purpose. And that purpose was to prepare us as God's people for works of service, so that we could attain the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. The whole measure, so that we would, as mature Christians, mature believers, as a body, we would achieve together this fullness, this basically, you can think of it like an outline of Jesus, and that he's being filled up, like you're being dropped in one at a time. And when we all are mature, we're going to all be dropped into this outline of Jesus, and it's going to reach the top. Now, that's a very simplistic and probably unproductive way to look at it, but it is a way of looking at it. And the point here is this, is that there's a process, there's a preparation that happens. It's not, the church is not the kind of what I would call Christian Amway. It's not just get people in so that you can get people in so that you can get people in. There's something that needs to be happening while we're here. And that revolves around our preparation for works of service. Service is not just something that is an activity that's tacked on to the Christian life. Now, how many of you guys have ever done service projects in the church? Anyone ever done a service project? We're going to do a service project. And, there's nothing wrong with service projects, but the problem is that sometimes we have this view of Christianity, like there's this Christianity that exists, and service is kind of a thing that gets tacked on or added on to the side of it, but that's not the way that it is. And in order to understand why that's not the case, we want to look today at this idea of holiness. And we're going to look at three things. First of all, we're going to look at what is holiness. And then secondly, we're going to look at the cultus, C-U-L-T-U-S, the cultus. And then third, we're going to look at serving in holiness. And hopefully we'll understand at the end of this very important point, which is that holiness is basically becoming whole and becoming complete. It's coming up to and fulfilling this image of Christ, the fullness, the full measure of Christ. And you cannot experience that without service. Now, this isn't going to be one of those sermons where, I'm trying to recruit people for the nursery. And so, this is my attempt to somehow finagle you into that. This hopefully is something by the end of it, you see service in a different light, not as something that is either tacked onto the Christian life, as I said previously, or something that is, one of those things that we all kind of grin and bear it with, but something that you actually look forward to and you see as a joyful part of the experience of being in Christ. So first of all, let's look at what is holiness. And in order to see what holiness is, we're going to contrast it a little bit and compare it to the idea of righteousness, because those terms are often found together. And the reason is because there's a lot of overlap between them, but there are some differences. To be righteous means to be in right standing with something. And that's usually, or oftentimes in Scripture, related to the law. There's a law of God, and when you're righteous, you are in right standing with that law of God. You're not in contradiction to it. You're not breaking it. How many of us are righteous in the terms of the speed limit? Okay, we got one. Thank you very much. Thank you for representing. Most of us are not righteous in terms of the speed limit, right? We're not in right standing with it. We view it as maybe a suggestion, maybe not even that. But because of that, we're no longer in right standing with it. But it's important to understand that this idea of righteousness as a right standing with the law is a little bit incomplete, because the law is interesting because God is not under the law, and we can talk about God's righteousness, right? When we say that God is righteous, we don't mean that God sits there and he goes, well, there's a law over me, and the difference between me and you is I follow it. Because if that were the case, then the law would be higher than God. God would no longer be God. He would no longer be the apex, the greatest thing. He would no longer be at the top. And so there's a greater understanding of righteousness that is just one of being in right standing with the law. The law, in fact, the Bible tells us, is that the law is a revelation of God's character and nature. And so God doesn't sit there and say, I need to be in right relationship to the law. No, the law has a necessity of being in right relationship to Him. And so when Jesus comes and He's walking this earth and He's carrying out His ministry, Jesus is fulfilling the law. And so the interesting thing about Jesus is, on the one hand, He's freeing us from the law, but on the other hand, He's fulfilling the law. Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but He came to fulfill it. Well, what does that mean? It's not like Jesus came and said, man, I really need to study this law, and I need to make sure that I do everything contained and listed in it. I used to think about that. Like, what if Jesus was sitting there one day and He was reading and He realized that, hey, I was born in a place that there's some prophecies that I just happened to fulfill. I wonder if I can fulfill the rest. That's not the way that it worked. Because that's not the relationship between Jesus and the law. Jesus, as the Son of God, is God incarnate. The law was a description of Jesus, not Jesus was there trying to figure out how to fulfill the law. He didn't need to. He just needed to be Himself. Like, if Jesus never saw the law, it would be no problem, because the law was a description of Him. Jesus fulfills the law. And He does so effortlessly. The law says, do not lie, and Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's not in Jesus to lie. There's no possibility of that. So the righteousness of God is not His right standing with the law. And in fact, what's interesting is that it's a picture of His character and nature. And I even saw one theologian describe an aspect of righteousness as more of an issue of relationship. That when we talk about the righteousness of God, we're not talking about His kind of being in right relationship or standing to the law, because the law is just a description of Him, but the righteousness of God can be seen as the lengths that He will go to keep His relationship with us. And at first I read that and I thought, well, that can't be right. That sounds so weird. But when you think about the love of God and the mercy of God and the kindness of God, Well, what are all those things but descriptions of his character and nature? Like this is a picture of somebody who will go to these extraordinary lengths to keep a relationship with humankind. Now that's righteousness. So how does holiness play into this? Well, holiness means to be set apart, as we said. God is set apart. He's the only self-existent being. He's in a completely unique category. There's a sense in which you cannot compare God to anything, because he's completely unique. There's nothing like him in all of existence. He's full of glory. He's full of majesty. He's full of power. And so there's this aspect of holiness that is God being set apart, but there's also this idea of wholeness or completeness. And the reason that God is set apart is because he's the only thing in existence that's whole and complete. God needs nothing. He's the only self-existent being. He's the only necessary being. He's the only one that stands alone and needs nothing and no one for who he is. And so he is set apart because he is whole, because there is nothing lacking in him. Everything else has being only because of him. And so our own holiness, our own completeness, our own set-apartness stands in relationship to him. And so one of the things that's interesting is holiness is often used. In fact, in the Old Testament, it kind of revolves around the idea of the temple or the tabernacle, the place where God dwells. And that place was to be holy. It's not like you could go in there and have a game of cards. You're not going to go into the temple of God and sit down and, play a couple hands of poker. You're not going to go into the temple of God and, run a business. You're not going to go into the temple of God and do anything outside of orient yourself to him. Well, why is that? Because God is holy and set apart, and everything that comes near him becomes or has a necessity to be holy. Everything has to be consecrated. Everything has to be set apart. Now, what does that mean? It means this. Let's say all of us in here were part of the priestly class, and we went and served in the temple, and we said, we've got somebody coming over today, and they brought a friend that we didn't expect. We're out of cups, and as a priest, I know that there's a cup that's on the table of showbread with strong drink in it, and I think to myself, I can go grab that cup, and then I can use it for my dinner party because I don't want somebody to be without a cup. And so, as a priest, I run over to the temple, and I grab that cup, and I, dump it out, and I wash it up, and I put it out, and would that be wrong or right? It would be wrong, right? Why? Because as being set apart, these things are only for the purposes of God. They come into the presence of God, and they're only to be used for what he desires. They have to orient themselves around him. That's what it means to be holy. And all holiness comes in relationship to him. Our completeness only stands in relationship to him. What is that? Why? Well, because as the only complete being, God has created everything, and everything else, its existence is dependent on him. And so it gets its holiness by standing in right relationship to him. Does that make sense? Think about going to your house. If you find something in your house that you haven't used in 5 years and that serves no purpose, you have no need for it, you have no desire for it, you don't like the way that it looks, you don't like the way that it smells, you don't like the way that it sounds, you don't have any purpose for it, it's only taking up space, what do? You give it to somebody else, right? You give it to somebody else. Re-gift. No, you get rid of it, right? Why? Because it no longer is connected to you, and so it's not going to be in your presence anymore. It has to have a justification that comes from you. That's the idea of God's holiness. God has created everything, and so everything only has any kind of holiness to it in relationship to him. If it has no purpose, if it doesn't relate to him, if it doesn't orient itself to him, if it's not what he wants it to be, if it doesn't fulfill the use that he has for it, if there's no reasoning for it that comes from his mind and that it abides by, then it doesn't belong. So our completeness, our wholeness, our set-apartness only comes in relationship to him. Now, does that mean that we have to be completely whole like him? No. We have to just be complete and whole as a person and as the person that God made us to be. How many of you have a toaster at home? Anyone here have a toaster? You have a toaster at home? Is it a good one? If you have a good toaster, raise your hand. How is it as a blender? Pretty good? No, probably not, right? Because it doesn't need to be. In order to be a good toaster, it doesn't need to be a blender. In the same way, as human beings, do we have the need to be God? No. We have the need to be who God created us to be and to serve him in the ways that he has called us to serve. And so our wholeness, our completeness is not uncategorical like his is, but it comes in the categories that he has made for us. But our glory is found in relation to him. We are made in his image, and so as he has glory, we have glory. Now, there's this movie that my sons used to watch a lot, and so by extension, I used to watch it a lot when they were young. And I've talked about it before, The Sandlot. Anybody here seen the movie The Sandlot? And if you remember, the premise of the movie is what? That they've lost a baseball over a fence, and they have to get it. Now, why do they have to get it? Do you guys remember? There was something special about it. What's that? Signed by Babe Ruth. And because it's signed by Babe Ruth, they have to go over the fence and get this ball because the kid who took it from his dad's study didn't realize who Babe Ruth was. He thought it was some woman, remember? It was signed by some woman. And he doesn't realize that it's Babe Ruth, the great Bambino. And so all of the kids of the Sandlot embark on this mission to try to get that ball back from this guy's backyard. But the problem is that there's this giant dog that's back there that's keeping them from fulfilling their mission. Do you guys remember that? Why is that movie, why does the premise work? Well, the premise works because it's not an ordinary baseball. It's signed by Babe Ruth. And that's the picture. See, we understand holiness even though we don't understand that we understand it. Imagine if you found a bat in maybe your mom's attic, a baseball bat, and you went and you decided that you're going to sell it, and so you put maybe $5 on it. It's old. You put $5 price tag on it, and you put it out in the sale, and then somebody comes up to you and says, I was going to buy that bat, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And you're like, well, $4? They're like, no. See, the problem is this. What you don't understand is that was Babe Ruth's bat. Is the price still going to be $5? $4? No, it's going to be huge, right? Why? Because it's Babe Ruth's bat. And see, because it had a connection to him, and because he used it, it was in his service, some of his glory is now given to that bat. It's shared, it's imparted to that bat or imputed to that bat. And the thing is that that bat would be special because he used it and it would bear the marks of his use. Right? It would have the scars of the things that maybe, he used to hit his cleats on it, and so it would have those marks on it. And maybe he sanded down the handle so that it would fit his hands better. And maybe, he wanted a certain weight, he wanted a certain length. It would all be for him. And it would all be for him to achieve the task that Babe Ruth had in mind. You see, that's the whole idea of glory, and that comes with holiness. When you're set apart for God, you're set apart for God's service. God has intentions in his world, in his kingdom. God has a plan. God has a destination for all of creation. God is working in the world, and God has the things around him that he has so that they will not only do his service, but in doing so also bear his glory. And the service and the glory come hand in hand, because here's the thing. If you can find Babe Ruth's Kleenex That's not going to be nearly as valuable as Babe Ruth's baseball bat. Why? Because Babe Ruth was glorious in terms of baseball. You see my point? The point is this, is that the glory comes in relation to the service and your fitness for the service, and as God shapes you and molds you for service, you become more and more and more glorious. Blessing is found in the presence of God. Why? Because He fits us for service. He customizes us. He glorifies us. He makes us exactly what we need to be to carry out His will. And in so doing, the more that we carry out His will, the more glory we receive. Why? Because the more holy we become. In fact, you could say that the blessing that we receive is not really distinguishable from our use or purpose or service. God, one of the purposes He has for us is to show the great love and mercy that He has. You say, I don't want to be used by God. Well, one of the things He wants to do is show His great mercy and His great love and His great compassion. You don't want to be part of that? Let's say you had a super rich uncle and he just wanted to show how generous he was, and so he said, I want you to be the vehicle of that. I'm going to shower you with generosity so that you can show everybody how generous I am. You might think that he has some weird motives, but you probably wouldn't say, nah, doesn't sound good to me. I'm not going to be used by anyone. Right? You would say, oh man, that's awesome. Maybe you're a little weird, but you see here in God, it's not weird because God wants to publicize His great glory. Why? So that people can come to Him. He wants to publicize His great kindness. Why? So that people will come to Him. He wants to publicize His great mercy. Why? So that people will come and be reconciled to Him. And part of our fitment for service is that we become glorified through that as we become holy. All of us should desire. See, here's the thing. If you're like me, you grew up in one of those churches that was kind of a little bit rough, a little bit strict, and the word holiness didn't have great connotations for you. But for each one of us, we should desire holiness. I want to be set apart. I want to be used by God. I want to be fit for His purposes. Because my glory and my blessing are intimately tied to those things. In John chapter 15, verse 1 and 2, it says, I am the vine and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes so that it will even be more fruitful. We want to be pruned by God. Jesus is the vine. That's what He is. That's what He does. He is fruitful. He is the fruitful man. He is the ideal of the fruitful man. And His Father is the vine dresser. He's the one that prunes us so that we all become like Him, to equip His people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Do you see? God is pruning us so that we can attain the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. God is glory, and He is about glorifying things. God is about glorifying things. God is about making things fruitful, making things majestic, making things amazing. He's about bringing all things to their fullness. And if you don't want to participate in that, then you don't want to participate in Him. If you don't want to be used, not only to be a picture of the fullness that He creates, but also then to turn around and be like Him and create fullness in the world around you. If you don't want to be part of that, then you don't want to participate in Him, because that's who He is. And that's what holiness means. If you don't want to be a part of that, then you have no place in His creation because it reflects Him. And I know that's a strong statement, but that's the picture that He gives for us. In Matthew chapter 8, verses 11 through 13, He says, I say to you, this is at the tail end of the story of the centurion. And if you remember, there's a guy, and he's not an Israelite, and he knows he's got a sick servant, and he tells Jesus, you don't need to come to my house, just say it and it's going to be done. And Jesus is like, man, not even the Israelites are like this. And in Matthew 8:11 it says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where they will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, Go, let it be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. You see, the servant had faith that God, that his son Jesus, what they were about is going and making things full. Making things complete, making things whole, making things as good as they could possibly be. He had faith that that's what he was about, and he had all power to do that. And so he said, look, just say the word. I know it's going to happen. I know because I know who you are. I know what kind of God you are. And Jesus says, man, there's going to be people all over the world who have that kind of faith, and they'll be sitting down at the table. But the sons of the kingdom, there's going to be Israelites here who don't have that kind of faith. And what will happen to them? They'll be thrown out where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus says that about the servant who was given the 1 talent. Basically what he's saying is, look, if you're not about growing things, about maturing things, about serving in this way that everything comes to the fullness, the fullest thing that it can be, then you don't have a part of creation, because that's all what creation is. Why? Because it reflects me, and that's what I'm about. So let's talk about, secondly here, the cultus. Now, this word cultus is a weird word, because as soon as we use it, we think about cults, right? And this is where I go off and say, hey, I'm going to be up in my prayer tower, and if you don't send all your money, I'm going to die. So what is the cultus exactly? This is where we get the word, remember, we've talked about this previously, this is where we get the word for worship and culture and farming or agriculture. And why do we have this? Well, because this is the work that God is engaged in, and this is the work that His creation is engaged in. This is the work that as we are made holy to Him, that we are engaged in. That's the whole point of this passage. Christ Himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, the teachers, what? To equip God's people for works of service. God's people are going to go around doing what? They're going to serve. What does that mean? They're going to make things glorious. They're going to make things complete. They're going to make things whole. They're going to make things fruitful. They're going to make things blessed. They're going to put things in the highest place that they can be, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, become mature, attaining the whole measure of the fullness of God. So we're going to do this in the world. We're going to do this with each other. We're going to do this in our relationship with God, and through that we're going to become complete. We're going to live up to the head, that is Christ. Well, it's interesting that these words, they don't seem to have a connection, but they do, because really what we are seeing is we're seeing things at 3 different levels. We're seeing service at 3 different levels, because we call it the worship service, right? And it's kind of weird because, service, worship service, like when we think of service, we think when we need to go out and, pull weeds. We need to go take care of babies in the nursery. We need to do something unpleasant. And then we come here in the worship service, and it seems like it doesn't seem the same thing. But that's because we have to understand that we operate on 3 different levels, and this word of cultus has the same meaning at each level, even though they look different. So on the bottom level, the basement level, what do we have? We have agriculture, which is cultivating things that are beneath you, things that are below you, the physical things of creation. So you go out and you cultivate those things. But then there's this level of culture, and that's the level of humankind, and that's your level. So you have to cultivate the level below you, and then you have your level, the level of human beings, and you have to cultivate that. So that's what culture is. And then you have the level above you, and you cultivate in that level, and that is worship. So how does this work? Well, I was watching this thing this week. It was fascinating. There's this really interesting guy named Jake Tackiff, and he has this farm called Cedar Springs Farm, and it's out in western Colorado. It's in the high desert. And what's really interesting is there's sagebrush and tumbleweeds, and it's high desert. It's useless, and you can tell exactly where his property ends. and his neighbor begins, because his is lush grassland and fertile and water and this great farm, and then like right at the fence line, it's just dead. And it's because he practices this thing called regenerative agriculture. And what that means is that he's trying to bring the land about to its most fruitful state possible. And in order to do that, he has to have a lot of knowledge. And he uses interesting tools. He uses cows, and he uses pigs, and he uses geese, and he uses water. And what he does is, through knowledge, he starts to reshape the land. The first thing that he does is he realizes that beaver go and they build dams, and what that does is it takes streams and it spreads out the water on the land, and it raises the water table so that more fruitful things can grow there. So he, looks at the land like a beaver does, and he says, well, where should I kind of stop things up a little bit so that the water spreads out? And so he's got ponds and stuff on his land. There's nothing like that on the rest of the properties around him. And then he says to himself, well, all we have is we have a toxic kind of weed that likes to grow here, and I don't want to spray Roundup everywhere. And so what he does is he understands that those weeds have a certain time of the year where they're kind of vulnerable, and so he comes and he brings all of his cattle on the places that the most of those weeds are, and they trample it and they eat it, and he's weakening those weeds. And so now what's happening is that there's these little worms that come in because the weeds are weak, and they can attack it and they eat the seeds, and so now the weeds are getting less and less. And he also realizes that there's a certain time of year where those weeds spread toxins into the soil, which is why no other plants can compete with them. And so during those times of the year, he floods that property and tries to wash that toxin out of the soil. And then slowly over time, what he's doing is he's reclaiming that. And he's using geese to make sure that his ponds and his streams are healthy, because there's a lot of things that they do. They aerate the water, and they clean up the algae, and they do all kinds of great things. And so he has this amazing knowledge. And what is he doing? He's putting things in its most glorious, most productive, most fruitful state. And if you look at his land, he's been doing it for like 7 or 8 years on this piece of property. It is completely different than it was when he took over, and it's completely different than his neighbor's land. Why? Because he's working, he's serving, it's the cultus. It's agriculture. He's taking that land, he's taking something below him, and he's making it what it is. And you say, well, I'm not a farmer. But you probably deal with something physical. And your job is to make that thing as glorious as you can. And we drive mudmobiles. They're called cars. You guys remember the Adobe? On Saturday Night Live, it was the car from Mexico that was made out of mud. Well, we kind of have that, because really, what is your car made out of? It's made out of steel, it's made out of those kinds of things, and you mine that out of the earth. You take certain parts of the earth and you turn it into a car. The thing is that most of us work in some kind of way like this, but we don't connect it to service. And if we did, what we would find is that we would see our lives as more holy than we do now. But most of us, what we see is that most of what we do takes place on the level of culture. It takes place as we try to help each other to become as fruitful and productive as possible. Each one of us has a responsibility to those around them, our family members and those around them. God has placed us in that field to work and to make a difference in the lives of other people. To serve in a way that glorifies them, that helps them to become as Christ-like as possible. And we do that by bearing each other's burdens, and we do that by serving each other, and we do that by sharpening each other as iron sharpens iron, and we do that by speaking truth to each other, and we do that by praying for each other, and there's a whole host of things that we do. And I just want to encourage you in this moment. We have this eat together time, this food and fellowship time that's coming up next week. And I want you, because it's happening, when I say next, this is Sunday, so technically this week. I want you to think about being a part of that. Why? Because this is the time, the opportunity for us to do this with each other, to encourage one another and to be patient with one another and to love one another. And we do this and we build each other up. And then we do this together here in temple worship. We do this together as we orient ourselves to God. We serve and we formulate the ways that we serve, and we formulate the ideas of the glory of God, and we formulate songs, and we formulate our relationship to God, and we do this, we serve in this way. Worship, serving and enjoying and glorifying God is one of the huge ways that we participate in this. So let's talk finally about serving and holiness. So as we hopefully see, serving is not something that's tacked on to our Christian life. It's something that we all participate in. And so when this passage in Ephesians chapter 4 says Christ gave us the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip His people for works of service. Those works of service are going to happen on the level of each other. They're going to happen on the level of what we do with the earth. They're going to happen on the level of how we glorify God. And in doing that, the body of Christ will be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. This isn't ancillary to our Christian life. This is completely harmonious with it and one with it. And you can't have a Christian life without it. All of existence can be seen through the lens of temple service. If you remember in Exodus chapter 3, verse 5, Moses was out and he saw this burning bush. Do you guys remember that? And it says, "Do not come any closer," the burning bush says, but we know it's God speaking through it. "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." And you say, well, why was that ground holy? Because it was set apart for God's service. It was serving God by being where His presence was so that He could speak to Moses. And that one place at that time was holy ground, just that one place. And then later, the holy ground was where the temple was, because that's where the presence of God was. And so in the Old Testament, you had these small parts of land that were set apart, the places where God was. But you remember that when Christ died, that the veil that separated that holy ground from everything else was torn. And the picture was this, that God is not content with just having one small piece of ground be holy, set apart for His service. That the whole world is supposed to be set apart for His service. And so now God is on the offensive, and the whole world is going to become holy ground. Well, how is that going to happen? Because God's presence is going to be in each one of us. And as we spread out through the world and we are holy to God, then everything is going to become holy ground. The problem is that as Christians, sometimes we live our lives as if we're in the Old Testament and we have a small piece of our life that's cordoned off to be for God's service. It's just one little piece of our life that's holy ground. But the problem is that that's not enough. Why? You say, well, I'll give you God this piece of my life, God. I'll give you Sunday morning. I may give you, a Wednesday night. I'll give you a little bit, but I'm not going to give you any more. My question is, why would you want to do that? Everywhere we go and everything that we do can be holy. And we want to do that because when it's holy, God is there. And if God is there, then all the blessings that come from Him are there as well. We sang a song, through it all, what? My eyes are on you. Through it all. The hope of that song was that in my life I can experience the joy of God, I can experience the peace of God, I can experience the love of God, the kindness of God, the mercy of God, the riches and the glory of Christ. I can experience that, but I only want to give that just a little bit of my life. No, if you had that opportunity, you would want all of your life to be that. All of your life can be given over to God.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.